I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and as I come in to Phil Collins in the air tonight, welcome to the first edition of the World of MMA. This is a show that we're going to be having weekly here, or every few weeks. We're going to see how it goes, where we're going to be discussing obviously everything involved with MMA. We're going to have a different track every time we start, connected to a fighter that we'll be discussing at some point on the show. Now, obviously, most recently, it would be Darren Till, who came out to Phil Collins in the air tonight, of course, when he fought Donald Cowboy Cerrone in his most recent fight. Of course, very impressive win for Darren Till. So what are we going to be discussing today? Okay, well, I want to have a look at a few things. So I want to start off at probably the event that all of us are looking forward to the most for a January event. As a single fight, I would say, is probably UFC 220, Francis Ngannou versus Stipe Miocic for the heavyweight title. Now, as we get closer to this card, I will do a full breakdown of the whole card. But I'm just going to give a brief overview here. And I feel that this is one of the biggest fights in the heavyweight division for a long time. It just has that feel. I think we can all agree that rarely have we seen someone in the heavyweight division, or any division for that matter, with the punching power of Francis Ngannou. Obviously, most recently, we've seen that in his fight with Alistair Overeem. That footage has pretty much gone viral now a lot of times. One of the most powerful uppercut knockouts I think anyone has probably seen. It's definitely up there for me, and I've been watching MMA and UFC and various different organizations, since I was a kid. But we all can tell that, there's things about this fight that we're not sure about. There's uncertainties. Ngannou, as dominant as he's been in the UFC, obviously he's 6-0 since he's come into the UFC. And, for the most part, he's just been wrecking people, really. Looking like an absolute destroyer. People question his wrestling capabilities quite a lot. I think people question his cardio, potentially, over a 5-round fight. But really, I just want to highlight here with that, I think we've seen in a few fights already, when he fought Overeem, Overeem sort of charged at Ngannou, and you could tell once Overeem got into the clinch with Ngannou, it was just like, oh, shit, this guy is incredibly strong. I'm not going to be able to just bully him around in the clinch, right? So you got that feeling. And, you have to say, if you look at a fight, say, for instance, when Ngannou fought Curtis Blades, a very good wrestler. Ngannou was dominant for most of that fight. Really, it was a dominant. He didn't get the finish, it was a decision win, but it was dominant, from what I can recall. And everyone feels like, well, okay, let's see. It's very likely that that Stipe could be the one to test Ngannou's wrestling defense and ground game and general competence over a 5-round fight more than anyone that he's faced so far. It's very possible. Stipe's a champion, of course. We know what Stipe's done. He's been on an absolute tear as well to get to the title. Also finishing Alistair Overeem, but also, defeating other fighters, high caliber, top heavyweights, some of the greatest evers, people like Fabricio Verdum, of course, Junior Dos Santos. So, Stipe's the man. There's no doubt about that. But I have to say, in this fight, I fear for him. It's one of these ones where, Ngannou is such a nightmare for people to go and step into the cage with right now. I just feel that Stipe, as confident as he is about this fight, which, every interview I've seen him in so far, I mean, obviously, I saw him on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he was obviously discussing the fight, and we had the UFC 220 press conference just recently, a few days ago. And he seems really confident, Stipe. He seems like he feels like he's going to go in there, and no matter what Ngannou throws at him, he's going to find a way of coming out on top and retaining his title. But, and it's a big but, isn't it? I just don't believe that. I mean, let's put it this way. Yes, Ngannou has never faced anyone like Stipe Miocic before. I believe that to be true. But I believe it to be perhaps a little bit more heavy the other way round. I don't think Stipe has faced anyone like Francis Ngannou before. I don't think anyone has faced anyone like Francis Ngannou before, in terms of any of Ngannou's opponents. I just see a very strong likelihood here of a new champion. A very strong likelihood of Ngannou just landing a huge shot on Miocic. And look, yeah, sure, we've seen Miocic's toughness before in fights, his ability to come back. I mean, in the Overeem fight, for instance, I mean, obviously, Miocic got dropped real hard, and almost nearly choked out as well afterwards. In fact, Overeem, he actually thought he got the tap out. Whether or not that was because he got knocked out a minute or so later, I mean, I don't. That's probably up for debate. But ultimately, when Overeem fought Miocic, it was much closer than when Overeem fought Ngannou. And you can't use MMA math. Obviously, we know in this sport it's way too chaotic for something like that. However, there are certain scenarios where MMA math does apply. And, like I said, we're going to break down this fight in much, much more detail, as we lead up to fight week. But I do fear for Stipe Miocic here. I believe that, look, if Overeem can drop you, there is no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that Francis Ngannou, can drop you, and very likely drop you much harder than what Alistair Overeem can. I mean, this is not a joke, Francis Ngannou, essentially of all combat sport athletes currently in the world, pretty much has the hardest punch. Yeah, I mean, at the UFC 220 press conference, I think that is something perhaps that, Miocic might be thinking about leading up to the fight. Because I think he asked, Dana to repeat it or something. Dana White was talking about, that Ngannou's punching power is, more powerful than, a Ford Escort going, 50 miles an hour or something, or a sledgehammer over your head getting, dropped with all your weight on it. And I noticed that Miocic did notice that, and he did say what was that again, Dana? And then he sort of tried to play it off as good for him, but I'm still leaving with the title. But I think things like that, realistically, when you are a fighter, as you get closer to the fight, it is something which is going to play on his nerves. It's as simple as that. And I feel that, it's possible that there's going to be a scenario in this fight where it essentially feeds into Ngannou getting the knockout, is perhaps the slight fear that that Miocic could have, which any opponent would have, stepping in there with Francis Ngannou. I mean, Jesus, the guy is such a physical specimen. He's such an athlete. He hits so damn hard. He's so physically strong. I mean, this is the thing. When I hear people saying, yeah, but Miocic, with his wrestling, I understand that perspective, but from what I've heard, from people who've trained with Ngannou and, from past opponents, etc., is he is so physically strong. And you know how it goes in wrestling and grappling exchanges. You can have the much superior technique, to your opponent. However, if your opponent is considerably considerably physically stronger than you, they are going to have opportunities to just power out of situations, to just athlete out of it. Even though you have superior technique. I mean, go to jiu-jitsu schools, you can see that all the time when people are rolling. You might see some kid who's a 22-year-old athlete. He's freakishly strong, and then he goes and rolls with some sort of high-level purple belt or brown belt or something, who's perhaps not as maybe physically as strong, but technically is incredibly gifted with jiu-jitsu. And that purple belt or brown belt in some cases might be, quite shocked about how long the young athlete can survive and power, how many situations they can just power out of physically. I mean, it becomes draining more and more as that goes on, and obviously the technique then comes in, and obviously technique for the most part ends up winning over the long haul of a fight. However, this is fighting. When you mix punches in, this is MMA. When you mix strikes in, it changes everything, and I just think, like I say, it's very likely we're going to see a new heavyweight champion on January 20th. I think Francis Ngannou is probably going to land a big shot, and as much as I love Stipe Miocic, because he's been a great champion, and he's going to go down as one of the greats, regardless of what happens in this fight. But I believe that Francis has the potential to go down as the greatest heavyweight in UFC history, and I think a part of that is this fight, winning it, getting the title, and what can come after that. I think we all know that UFC Africa is something that the owners of the UFC have already been discussing before, very much similar to UFC Russia. However, I would say probably UFC Russia talks are sort of further along in discussion than UFC Africa. However, I see UFC Russia and UFC Africa happening possibly. 2018 maybe a bit soon. It's possible though if Ngannou becomes champion, and maybe at 155 if Khabib becomes champion. 2019 I think is a certainty that we'll see either a UFC Russia or a UFC Africa event. And if we have UFC Africa, a heavyweight champion like Francis Ngannou is just going to help hugely with ticket sales and promoting the event and just eyeballs on the event in general and TV viewings and all of these things. I mean, the guy can be a superstar. There's no doubt about it. And I feel that the UFC owners probably do want Francis to win this fight. Obviously, as we hear, in the news, the guy pretty much lives at the UFC, Athletes Institute, Performance Institute, and from the high-tech equipment they've got there that he has at his disposal, and high-level training partners, I just think that it's very likely that he's just going to continue growing strength to strength. And it is very strange to see the title challenger as the favourite, but I believe that in this scenario, it is warranted. It's such an exciting fight. I'm really buzzed for it. So I just wanted to start off today just by talking about this, guys, because, like I say, I'm pumped for this one. But I mean, obviously, people have said, perhaps the whole card of UFC 220 is not that great. Okay, but personally, I am so stoked for the top two fights, because obviously I'm going on about Francis Ngannou versus Stipe Miocic here, but at the same time, I'm really excited to see Daniel Cormier versus Volkan Ozdemir as well. That's going to be a great fight. Volkan Ozdemir, I mean, Jesus, the guy has been, really putting on some impressive wins, early finishes, early knockouts over the likes of, Misha Serkinov and just recently, who did he knock out? Volkan Ozdemir. Jimmy Manuwa, that was it, yeah. And he's been looking really impressive. And Daniel Cormier, as we all know, for years, has pretty much been the number one light heavyweight as long as John Jones isn't around. And unfortunately for Daniel Cormier, he's always going to have that cloud sort of following him in his career. It's just one of those things, you know. It's like when Jose Aldo got beaten by Conor McGregor. Um, you know, it was always going to just, you know, for as far as fans are concerned, just taint the career. It's going to be the thing that one of the main things that people remember, unfortunately. Um, you know, and Daniel Cormier is such a great fighter. Just go back and look at his old Strikeforce fights when he was fighting at heavyweight and, you know, dominating, you know, huge heavyweights. People like, you know, like Josh Barnett and, you know, and Bigfoot Silver and stuff like this. Real, genuine, legit heavyweights. Um, and his performances at 205 obviously, you know, speak for themselves. Um, you know, and you know, it is very likely that Daniel Cormier actually is going to be able to do what I don't think Stipe Miocic will be able to do to Francis Ngannou. I think Cormier will be able to take down Volkan Ozdemir, and I believe he will be able to control him on the ground. And I think that that is probably how the fight will go. Um, but again, you can never count out a knockout artist like Volkan Ozdemir, especially early in a fight. But again, we'll be breaking that down in further detail. But I just wanted to start today with a little chat about UFC 220 because I think we're all hyped about that. But just moving on now, because like I say, we'll talk about UFC 220 in further detail as we get closer to fight week. Let's obviously talk about 155 pounds. Let's talk about Conor McGregor. Who's he fighting next? I mean, personally, I want to see him fight Khabib Nurmagomedov in Russia. That's the fight I want to see personally at 155 pounds. I believe those two are the best. However, you know, when you think of Tony Ferguson, current interim lightweight champion, it becomes very murky, doesn't it? It just becomes really muddy, this situation of where are we really going here. You know, Dana White just recently obviously had an interview with Kevin Iole and he was discussing the whole situation and really was sort of implanting a few little subtle hints there towards Conor McGregor and his team. You know, I believe the UFC really do want Conor to make a decision about his next fight over the next, you know, few weeks to a month. And I think they want him to agree to take a fight by sort of springtime, you know, March, April. I think that's when the UFC would like Conor to fight. But, you know, some of the word is that Conor is more looking towards August, September time. And if that is the case, again, in this interview Dana had with Kevin Iole, he pretty much implied that if Conor wants to wait that long, they're going to have to strip him of the title. And because then it'll be, you know, sort of 2 odd years since Conor's defended the title, you know, and I do understand that and I do appreciate that. I think it's the right decision because obviously the division does need to move on. However, obviously Conor McGregor is a very unique character, a very unique fighter, a very unique story in MMA. You know, the guy has gone from close to nothing to being one of the, well, not one of the best paid MMA fighter ever in the history of MMA, in such a short space of time. So the UFC are just going to have to get used to this moving forward, I believe, in terms of understanding that it is going to become more difficult to negotiate with Conor McGregor because the guy has made an insane amount of money. He does not need to continue fighting. He's got many, you know, as he's been pointing out recently in a little Twitter, you know, beef thing with Khabib, and you know, he's talking about his whiskey coming out soon, you know, and that is obviously, you know, and that's things like that are great money spinners for Conor McGregor at this point, you know, and I personally I'll want to buy some Conor McGregor whiskey. I'll buy some, you know. I mean, it's probably not going to taste any different to any other whiskey, but you know, I'll buy it just for the novelty, probably because I just want to keep a bottle after I finished it, right? Just to, and I think Conor will get a lot of people like that, you know, buying into anything that he's associated with outside of MMA. So UFC and the owners, they do need to accept this. This is a beast that they've created, a beast that they've allowed to grow. And he was always going to do this from my perspective after the Floyd Mayweather fight. I mean, what was he going to do? Was he going to, Is he going to run back to MMA after fighting, arguably the greatest boxer of all time? And, he's just going to come straight back now and fight for what, 250 grand against, someone like Tony Ferguson? I mean, this is the thing, he's got a big appetite now. He's seen big paydays, and obviously he's going to want more big paydays, and the UFC has to find a way to work this out. My fear, though, is, that they will end up having to strip Conor, that Conor will not make a decision in the next month or two. He'll keep playing his hinting game, I believe. And obviously we'll see what happens, but, you just can't deny that in terms of active MMA, UFC lightweights right now, Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson are the best two. It's as simple as that. I mean, obviously, just recently we've just watched Khabib, just absolutely dominate Edson Barbosa for 3 rounds. I mean, Barbosa is a high-level striker, really high-level striker. I mean, but yes, I mean, if you followed MMA and UFC as long as someone like me, or you've already seen Barbosa lose before in the octagon, right? We've seen that before, but with such dominance of grappling, I think you and me can all agree that never seen Barbosa dominated like that with wrestling. I mean, there was multiple points in the fight where, you can see on Barbosa's face as he's against the cage trying to stand up, it's just like he's just taking huge breaths, and his eyes just kept getting really wide because it's just insane pressure from Khabib. Just not something that Edson's used to, that most fighters can deal with. I feel that Tony Ferguson, with his jiu-jitsu and grappling skill, will be able to navigate around, not around, like through Khabib's pressure in a way that I don't think many other people before will be able to. I think Tony is very, very good at that. However, ultimately, Ferguson versus Khabib, I still would pick Khabib to ultimately do what he does, just dominate Tony Ferguson. I mean, Ferguson's probably got better boxing as well, but as we've seen before in Khabib fights, he's fought quite a few people who are much better boxers than him, and he has no fear of coming into the pocket. He knows he can take a shot, and he's fully willing to take a shot to get his hands on you and to just suffocate you and drag your ass to the ground, and just pummel you for as long as you're able to take, or until you basically give him a submission, and he'll just force you to submit. I don't believe anyone at 155 pounds right now is better than Khabib Nurmagomedov. And as interested as I am to see Tony Ferguson versus Khabib, and they may end up having to make that for the legit lightweight title if they have to strip Conor, if Conor's not ready anytime soon. Stylistically, I'm much more interested to see Conor versus Khabib, because in terms of, if you look at someone who could potentially beat Khabib Nurmagomedov, I believe that as a starting point, I would want them to be rangy, with a good boxing game, with good power in their hands, and Conor's got those things. But would he be able to stop that wrestling, man? This is the thing. I mean, Khabib Nurmagomedov is legendary when it comes to particularly wrestling in MMA. Obviously, if you follow the sport very closely, you'll know that there's videos online you can get of Khabib literally wrestling bears as a child, actual bears, which to my knowledge is something that in Dagestan, which is one of the best areas in the world at producing fighters, really. is very common for like special forces, like I think they called like Spetsnaz in Russia, and they go and live out in the wild for periods of times and fight bears and shit like that, and it's all part of becoming a man in that country and being a skilled fighter ultimately. And obviously, where he's been training at AKA Khabib, there's a lot of stories there as well about, just how strong he is. People like Daniel Cormier and Cain Velasquez, they would tell you, man, the guy is a fucking lightweight, but, he's got like wrestling strength of a light heavyweight. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not a joke. The guy has got some unique wrestling ability. And I do feel he will be the next champion at 155. Whether that's going to be against Ferguson or Conor will remain to be seen. But like I say, I mean, the UFC cannot complain about this. They've created this themselves, the situation with Conor McGregor, and they're going to have to deal with it now. Because, I mean, look, when we look at, if you look at the 155 rankings right now, I mean, it's just very clear. There's only one of two ways this can go. So it's going to be fascinating to see over the coming months, coming weeks and months even, what way we actually end up going. So that's obviously going to be fascinating to follow, and we'll see how that goes. I mean, because when you think about Conor as well, because you never know that he just might go up to 170. I know there has been moments of friction with Tyron Woodley in the past. Little comments made to each other back and forth, and Conor's a man of history. We know this, and having 3 titles, being able to say he's won 3 titles in 3 different weight classes is probably something Conor would probably like. Realistically, though, based on for instance, what Conor's fights with Nate Diaz at 170. I don't believe it would be a good idea for Conor McGregor to go up to 170 pounds. People like Tyron Woodley, are just going to be way too big for Conor, I believe. Someone like, if you think about how big some of these welterweights are in comparison to, say, Conor McGregor, it's not. I just don't believe it would be a good move for Conor. If you look at people like Darren Till, and Stephen Thompson, these are big 170 pounders. I don't believe it would be a good idea for Conor to go up to 170. Even if he did, though, he's not going to do it for a prolonged period of time. He'll just do it just for the title, I believe. But like I say, I mean, stylistically, I don't know if that'd be a good fight for Conor against Tyron Woodley. Obviously, Tyron hits incredibly hard, and it's far superior wrestling to Conor. But no, this is going to be obviously Conor is the biggest name in the game right now still, and so it's obviously going to be interesting to see what happens moving forward from here. So I mean, that's pretty much it for today, guys. I mean, we're just going to go sort of half an hour a week for now. See how we go. See what you guys think. We might sort of open up into a hangout, at some point soon. But I think as well, we just to finish up here, we'll talk about the upcoming weekend. So next weekend we do have what do we got? We got Jeremy Stephens versus Doo Ho Choi, UFC Fight Night. That's going to be interesting for the 145 pound division. Obviously, Doo Ho Choi is a very talented fighter and was involved in one of the best fights that I've ever seen, really, against Cub Swanson. But we haven't seen him since that fight, and I'm excited to see him back. But Jeremy Stephens is always fireworks, man, and I don't want to really call that fight right now. I'd probably go with Stephens based on being more active recently. But I don't know, man. Doo Ho Choi is a really talented fighter, and he's young, and who knows what he's been doing with his time off since his loss to Cub Swanson. Who knows? He may have improved leaps and bounds, in which case I wouldn't be surprised to see him beat Stephens. But just as an initial gut feeling, I'd probably go with Stephens, like I say, based on activity, experience, things like that. But there's a couple of good fights on that card, We got a couple of interesting ones. We got Vitor Belfort versus Uriah Hall. I mean, that's kind of interesting, right? Yeah, obviously Vitor Belfort on the downside of his career. Uriah Hall, maybe getting towards that period, um, but with a lot less fight years on Uriah Hall. So I expect Uriah Hall to continue competing for quite a bit longer. Certainly much longer than what Vitor Belfort should be. I mean, realistically, Vitor should probably be retired now. Statistically based on years. I mean, literally, the guy was fighting. You know, it was like over 20 years ago, wasn't it? Like his first professional fight. It was like in the old days, literally, like UFC 1 days. You know what I mean? So crazy. How long he's been involved in the sport. We've got Thiago Alves, Zach Cummings. That's an interesting fight there. We've also got what else we got here? We've got Paige Van Zandt versus Jessica Rose Clark. Be interesting to see Paige Van Zandt back in action. So a couple of good fights there. Darren Elkins, Michael Johnson. That's a good one. I can definitely get behind that. So yeah, as we know though, with UFC events, sometimes you never know. It's strange. It's hard to say. Sometimes a card that doesn't have much star power could end up being one of the best fight cards that you see, for a period of time. So we might have that with this Stevens versus Choi fight night card. You never know. So obviously we'll break that down in further detail as well as we get closer to that card, which is next weekend, like I say. So we'll probably see maybe on Thursday, Friday, we'll do a fight breakdown for Stevens versus Choi. And obviously, we're gonna move forward from here, guys. So, obviously, stay tuned for more from the world of MMA. Obviously, like I say, this has been the first part today. It's been a pleasure to have you joining me. Please do like, share, subscribe to this channel. If you love MMA, you want to see more MMA content. It's a huge passion of mine. So if it's a huge passion of yours too, we'll get along. You'll enjoy stopping by and just joining me for a few chats about MMA. This is it. I love talking about MMA. So that's what we're going to do week in, week out here. That's pretty much all we've got to say for today. I'm just going to check if there's anything else I want to cover before we go. No, I'm pretty happy with everything today, guys.